For people, everything he has done is attack people. The budget was an attack on farmers, an attack on workers, an attack on pensioners, an attack on the young, and an attack on thousands of charities and businesses across the country. The whole system is broken, Mr. Speaker, and he is making things worse. He is making things worse. Is making things worse. Everyone is unhappy. Isn't it a good thing that the Chancellor is an expert at customer complaints?
Starmer once again became the laughingstock of this week's Prime Minister's questions as his opponent ruthlessly exposed every layer of his pretense, cowardice and foolishness. A spectacle worth watching, both pathetic and hilarious. Don't miss these fiery developments alongside the latest news from across the country. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss any of Starmer's next disasters.
He should resign and find out. Until then...
I'll decide when there's more.
Mr. Speaker, until then, I'm the one asking the questions. There's a petition out there, 2 million people asking him to go. He's the one who doesn't know. He's the one who doesn't know how things work. It is not government that creates growth, Mr. Speaker. It is business. His employment secretary, I don't see her here, she wants more young people in work. But businesses say they are cutting jobs because of the Chancellor's budget. His Deputy Prime Minister, she is not here. Her employment rights bill will stop business.
Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are trying to pin the responsibility for economic growth on the government, but the reality is that businesses are the true driving force of the economy. While Reeves calls for creating jobs for young people, she's conspicuously absent when it comes to hearing the truth. Businesses are being forced to cut staff due to the failed budget proposed by the Prime Minister. Her Labour bill is nothing more than a dangerous gimmick, making life harder for those striving to sustain and create jobs.
The CBI said on Monday that the dots of the government's policy don't join up. They're right, aren't they?
And she talks about a petition. We had a massive petition on the 4th of July in this country. And, we spent years taking our party from a party of protest to a party of government. They're hurtling in the opposite direction.
Just look at how Starmer handles the pressure to speak the truth. True to form, he chooses to dodge, retreating into his shell like a frightened turtle. Utterly contemptible.
What a load of nonsense, Mr. Speaker. We had a budget in March this year and tractors were not blockading the streets of Whitehall afterwards. So let me give him another example of a real business and made it easier for people. Everything he has done is attack people. The budget was an attack on farmers, an attack on workers, an attack on pensioners, an attack on the young, and an attack on thousands of charities and businesses across the country. The whole system is broken, Mr. Speaker, and he is making things worse. He is making things worse.
Their constituents will be affected. Carry on.
Mr. Speaker, he is making things worse. Everyone is unhappy. Isn't it a good thing that the Chancellor is an expert at customer complaints?
Sir Starmer once again demonstrates his lack of understanding by not only attacking vulnerable groups, but also steering the country into an even worse state. His proposed budget is nothing short of a devastating blow to farmers, workers, retirees and businesses, while those who truly grasp the issues are ignored. Starmer's actions offer no solutions. They only add to the growing chaos. It's clear he's not someone capable of resolving problems, but rather a figure who shirks responsibility and makes everything worse.
I think she's just read out the charge sheet against the last government. Everything is broken. And they come here every week with absolutely nothing to offer except complaints. Nothing constructive, no new ideas. They don't know what they're doing from one day to the next. Living in this fantasy world that everything was fine apparently for 14 years. Well, the country's fed up with those fantasies. They've got rid of those fantasies. We're going to take the hard decisions. They're jumping on every bandwagon that's passing. We're taking the country forward.
Unable to come up with a convincing argument, he resorts to the same tired tactic, blaming the previous government. This cowardice is undeniable proof that he is utterly unfit to continue in his role as leader. In other news, Angela Rayner, the UK's Deputy Prime Minister, has embarked on her first overseas trip since appointing a Foreign Affairs advisor. The visit, which included a stop at the Vatican and a meeting with Pope Francis, appears to be an effort to bolster her international profile, an ambitious but highly questionable objective. The newly established advisory role, introduced in September, is reportedly aimed at helping her build relationships with global leaders and elevate her personal standing. However, it's hard to ignore that this move seems more like a vanity project, offering no tangible benefits to the British public. Rayner currently holds multiple roles, including Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, but many doubt her ability to juggle such a demanding portfolio. Her apparent role as Keir Starmer's substitute for international engagements only underscores the Labour Party leadership's glaring incompetence. While she described her meeting with the Pope as a great honour, it merely highlighted the superficiality of her diplomatic manoeuvres. Her praise for the Pope's role in global issues seemed more like a self-serving attempt to polish her image than a genuine contribution to practical solutions. Notably, this marks the first time Rayner has posted on social media from abroad since September, a telling sign of her low international visibility. Chris Trott, the UK ambassador to the Holy See, thanked her for the visit, but his remarks came across as little more than polite formalities. Rayner's itinerary included a speech at the Pontignano Conference in Rome, an annual event traditionally attended by the UK Deputy Prime Minister. In 2023, the role was filled by Oliver Dowden, a figure widely regarded as far more competent. Ironically, Rayner's trip coincided with a critical moment in Parliament, where Kemi Badenoch delivered sharp criticism of Labour's proposed labour rights reforms. Rayner chose to be absent while businesses raised concerns over a budget that discourages investment in the UK. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer fared no better, defending his trip to Brazil for the G20 summit by dismissing criticisms as unconstructive. Both Labour leaders have shown an irresponsible focus on personal branding rather than addressing the country's pressing issues. Speaking more about Rachel Reeves, the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, has implemented a significant change in inheritance tax policy, ending tax exemptions for agricultural land and business property. This decision has sparked a wave of opposition from the rural community, but some ministers, including Steve Reed, the Secretary of State for Food and Rural Affairs, argue that it could benefit the agricultural sector. Steve Reed maintains that Rachel Reeves's inheritance tax campaign could bring positive changes to agriculture and food production. In a meeting with the Lords Environmental and Climate Change Committee, Reed emphasised that the inheritance tax would help prevent the pressure that increases land prices, reducing the incentive for wealthy non-farmers to purchase land as a tax avoidance strategy. He believes this would help keep land in agricultural production rather than allowing non-farmers to own and use land as a means of reducing their tax liabilities. However, Reed's remarks have sparked significant tension within the farming community. Thousands of farmers have protested, with some even driving tractors through central London to oppose the tax changes. A primary concern is that the inheritance tax will affect a larger number of farmers than anticipated. Jeremy Moody, Secretary of the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, CAA, pointed out that the number of farmers affected could be 5 times higher than the government's estimate. According to Moody, around 2,500 farmers could be required to pay the tax each year, rather than the 500 forecasted by the Treasury. This contrasts with a report from BBC Verify, the broadcaster's fact-checking agency, which sided with the government, suggesting the actual number may be lower than Moody's analysis. A government spokesperson asserted that the 500 farmers affected by the tax is based on actual data regarding agricultural and business property compensation claims. The government argued that while the inheritance tax would impact a small number of farmers, the tax rate is actually half that of other groups subject to similar taxes. Furthermore, Moody highlighted that the Treasury and BBC Verify may have overlooked certain groups of landowners who are not farmers, such as those who own land through agricultural partnerships, those who lease land for farming, or farmers who are shareholders in family-owned companies. When considering these groups, the number of people affected could be much higher than the government's forecast. Meanwhile, Members of the aristocracy, such as the Earl of Leicester and Sir Coke, have criticised Reed's view, arguing that the changes would not benefit farmers and could instead disadvantage private landowners compared to large corporations or organisations. Reed remains firm in his stance, asserting that the inheritance tax policy could help keep agricultural land in production for longer periods. The change in inheritance tax policy by Rachel Reeves raises numerous questions and controversies. While the government argues that the changes will bring long-term benefits to the agricultural sector, many farmers fear that it could lead to the loss of agricultural land and exacerbate their difficulties. Whether these measures will genuinely benefit the agricultural industry remains a hotly debated topic within the rural community and political sphere. Recently, Labour Party leader Keir Starmer unveiled plans to introduce legislation combating Islamophobia, sparking a wave of backlash from free speech advocates. This initiative was prompted by a pointed question from Labour MP Tahir Ali in the House of Commons, where he urged the government to commit to banning offences against religious texts and prophets of Abrahamic faiths. Ali's question not only ignited debate, but also exposed the flaws in Starmer's approach to sensitive issues like free speech. In response, Starmer reiterated a vague and performative stance. He pledged to combat all forms of hate and division, particularly Islamophobia, without clarifying whether these measures might suppress free speech. Declaring blasphemy as an action to be condemned, Starmer promised his government would decisively address the issue to foster a harmonious society. Yet, one must question whether this harmony is genuine or simply the imposition of shallow political correctness. Labour's deputy leader Angela Rayner previously hinted at the government considering a specific definition of Islamophobia. She likened the proposed approach to the definition of anti-Semitism adopted under Theresa May in 2016. This raises doubts about whether Labour's intentions genuinely centre on protecting Muslims or merely on pandering to specific voter demographics through symbolic gestures. At the core of the controversy lies the APPG's all-party parliamentary group proposed definition of Islamophobia, which frames it as a form of racism targeting Muslim cultural expressions or perceived Islamic affiliations. Though endorsed by Labour's National Executive Committee in 2022, the definition has faced fierce criticism. Many argue it paves the way for suppressing legitimate criticism of religion, reducing free speech to a mere luxury. Critics contend that such a vague and easily exploitable definition amounts to a veiled blasphemy law. These concerns are far from unfounded, especially given Labour's repeated capitulation to factional pressures. Conservative Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick warned Labour against passing such legislation, accusing Starmer of lacking genuine leadership. Jenrick argued that free speech faces a severe threat from within the Labour Party, framing this as not just a political issue but a crisis of values and principles. Former Cabinet Minister David Davis also voiced his frustration. On social media, he emphasised that criticising religion has been an integral aspect of free speech in Britain for centuries. Davis chastised Starmer's evasive response to Tahir Ali's question, labelling it a sign of political cowardice. Former Home Secretary Suella Braverman joined the chorus of critics, cautioning that Labour's proposed definition risks setting a dangerous precedent by prohibiting dissenting views on Islam. Braverman asserted that no religion should be immune from scrutiny or public challenge, and no one is entitled to protection from offence, particularly when constructive discussions are at stake. Toby Young, founder of the Free Speech Union, highlighted that the APPG's definition is overly broad, potentially encompassing historical facts like Islam's expansion through conquest. He argued that this undermines free expression and sets a perilous precedent for restricting legitimate public discourse. The debates surrounding the definition of Islamophobia are not merely political, but reflect a profound crisis in how Labour confronts the fundamental value of free speech. Behind the guise of humane policy lies an imposition of dogmatic thinking, pushing society toward covert censorship and placing Britain's cherished freedoms at grave risk of erosion. Finally, a series of fake bomb threats were sent to members of Donald Trump's prospective cabinet on Wednesday, sparking widespread concern over the gravity of the situation. According to initial reports, the threats appear to be linked to pro-Palestinian activists. The targets included high-profile figures such as Pete Hegseth, John Ratcliffe, Elise Stefanik, Lee Zeldin, Brooke Rollins and Howard Lutnick, all of whom were being considered for key positions in the new cabinet. In particular, Lee Zeldin, nominated to lead the Environmental Protection Agency, received a threat explicitly voicing support for Palestine. The threat targeted his family and their private residence, causing significant distress. Fortunately, at the time of the incident, his family was not home and no one was harmed. Authorities are actively investigating to shed light on the matter and determine the motives behind these actions. According to Fox News, nearly a dozen individuals on Trump's cabinet shortlist have been targeted. Emergency response teams were deployed to related locations to conduct safety checks. Among the victims was Matt Gaetz, who was being considered for the role of Attorney General in Trump's administration. The targeting of Gaetz further underscores the severity and calculated nature of these threats. However, police reports confirmed that no explosive devices or physical threats were found at any of the locations. These incidents have been classified as swatting, a tactic involving false reports intended to provoke an emergency response from authorities. Swatting has become an increasingly common method of harassment and intimidation aimed at individuals or groups.